Netflix series Dark is really, really good. So there are two sides to this. The one side is it has kind of a, over time, it has kind of a trashy TV feeling. That said, most of everything else is great. The storytelling is really, really good. And I found myself constantly trying to analyze what actually the relationships between all those different people were. And then you start to realize that you don't really analyze the logic of the film so much, even though you are currently still doing this. If you compare Dark to something like a Christopher Nolan movie, like Tenet, for example, I found myself kind of disappointed with Tenet because it wasn't that logical, at least not as logical as I expected. But of course, this is just a much higher standard, and I found myself, because it's a TV show, that the standard was kind of lowered for myself, and I could enjoy the whole thing much more. And also, I just thought the whole thing was kind of well developed. I mean, there are basically 3 different timelines, and so there is the origin timeline, there is the timeline Jonas has, and there is also the timeline Martha has. So Martha's timeline is basically the alternative timeline, and of course the origin timeline is the origin timeline. And now what I found myself is, I think it's quite well thought out. With Christopher Nolan's Tenet, for example, I found myself analyzing the time travel logic, and maybe it's the fact that Dark is actually embracing these paradoxes. It's basically stating that in the beginning there is the timeline, and then there is basically a hiccup in the timeline, which is the loop that consists out of these 2 alternative timelines. And once the loop is resolved, and we don't actually never know or find out how many times this loop actually runs, and it also doesn't really matter, because actually this loop doesn't really exist, because the original timeline, after the loop basically ends, just continues. But of course, there had to be something in the original timeline that started the loop, and then the loop started the thing that then continued the original timeline. So it's kind of a paradox, actually, and that's kind of the whole thing. You just think, oh yeah, it's just a paradox. Whereas in Christopher Nolan's Tenet, I found myself just trying to find the solution to this movie, because I thought it was a puzzle that I just had to solve. And you can actually partially solve this puzzle, because the whole thing is also just one linear timeline where you just visit in at different times. And that's kind of the solution for Tenet, for understanding Tenet, I think, that the whole thing is just one linear timeline. And the solution for understanding Dark is basically what I just stated. The whole thing is just one loop. Within this loop, we have these 2 alternative timelines, Martha and Jonas' timeline, and the original timeline just continues after the fact. Of course, there is still the problem, as I mentioned already. In the original timeline, the creator of the time machine, the original creator of the time machine that then creates these universes, starts these 2 universes because he starts these things. And then after the loop basically ends in the end of the series, Jonas and Martha actually stop his son, the creator's son, so the time machine's creator's son, from having a car accident and from trying to get his son back. And that's basically what starts the whole thing, but also what ends it. But yeah, well, if it then ends, it never happened, but it had to begin in the original timeline. It had to start the loop in order for the loop to be created. But when it then actually never happened, because the loop closes itself and basically eliminates itself, then the problem is that, well, the causal relation is that the loop causes the original timeline to continue, and the original timeline causes the loop to be created, and then the loop creates or continues the original timeline. One cannot really exist without the other. The original timeline cannot continue without the loop, but the loop basically doesn't exist, and it also is caused by the original timeline. And that's kind of still a problem with Dark, but overall I think it is just a very good series, apart from one major downside. every time the apocalypse happens, there is basically this big giant sphere. It's like a big ball of black, a big sphere of black. And this just doesn't look very good. The CGI is just not as good. And this made the whole thing kind of look crappy. Additionally, after the first few episodes, maybe also after the first season, the whole thing starts to feel a little bit like a series because it repeats itself. Obviously, because the whole thing is that it repeats itself constantly. But if Jonas, the older Jonas, Adam basically, just states for the 5th time or the 10th time that the apocalypse is about to happen, I mean, it's something we already heard at this point in time, and it's something that's not really new at this point in time. So that was a quick review of Netflix series Dark.